Have you ever been completely certain someone would always be there, only to realize one day they had emotionally disappeared long before they physically left? Most people think relationships end with a dramatic argument, a breakup, or one unforgettable moment. But psychology tells us something very different. The strongest emotional exits are often the quietest. They happen internally, long before anyone else notices. Here's what most people completely miss. An empath doesn't usually stop caring because of one mistake. They stop caring because their brain slowly reaches a point where emotional investment no longer feels safe. Every ignored feeling, every broken promise, every one-sided conversation quietly rewires how they respond. By the time they appear calm, detached, or even indifferent, the real decision may have been made weeks, months, or even years earlier. That surprises many people because empaths are often known for their patience. They forgive more than most. They try to understand both sides. They give second chances that others never would. But patience has an invisible limit. When that limit is crossed, something fascinating happens psychologically. The emotional energy that once fueled endless understanding simply shuts off, not out of revenge, not to manipulate, but because the mind finally recognizes that continuing to invest creates more pain than peace. Have you ever noticed someone who suddenly stopped arguing with you? They no longer tried to explain themselves. They no longer reacted to your mixed signals. At first glance, it looked like maturity. In reality, it may have been emotional closure. This changes everything because most people mistake silence for temporary distance. They assume a little space will fix everything. But sometimes silence isn't a pause. It's the final chapter. By the end of this video, you'll understand the hidden psychology behind the 7 unmistakable signs that an empath is emotionally done with someone forever. More importantly, you'll discover why these behaviors aren't acts of punishment, but powerful indicators of emotional self-protection. And once you recognize these patterns, you'll never look at quiet detachment the same way again. One of the earliest and most overlooked signs that an empath is emotionally done with someone is surprisingly simple. They stop explaining themselves. At first, this can look like emotional maturity or a desire to avoid conflict. But beneath the surface, a profound psychological shift has already taken place. Empaths naturally seek understanding. They don't just want to express their feelings, they genuinely hope the other person will understand the emotional impact of their actions. That's why they often revisit difficult conversations, carefully choosing different words, changing their tone, or approaching the issue from another angle. They're not trying to win an argument. They're trying to build a bridge. But here's where it gets interesting. The human brain is constantly measuring whether effort produces results. When repeated attempts at honest communication are ignored, dismissed, or turned against them, the brain begins conserving emotional energy. This isn't weakness, it's an adaptive survival response. Emotional intelligence isn't just knowing how to express feelings, it's recognizing when expression no longer creates connection. Have you ever noticed someone who once wrote long messages suddenly starts replying with just a few words? They no longer defend themselves when accused unfairly. They don't interrupt to clarify misunderstandings. If you're expecting another heartfelt explanation, it never comes. Most people misread this silence. They assume the empath has finally accepted the situation or simply become less emotional. In reality, they've accepted something far more significant. They no longer believe being understood is possible. That realization changes their behavior more than any argument ever could. Imagine a woman who spent years telling her partner that she didn't need expensive gifts. She simply wanted honesty and consistency. Every conversation ended the same way. Promises were made, enthusiasm returned for a few days, and then everything slipped back into old patterns. Eventually, she stopped bringing it up altogether. her partner felt relieved because the complaints had ended. What he didn't realize was that the relationship hadn't become healthier. She had quietly stopped expecting emotional safety from him. This reveals one of the biggest psychological blind spots in relationships. People often celebrate the absence of conflict without asking why the conflict disappeared. Sometimes peace is a sign of healing. Other times, it's evidence that hope has quietly left the room. Almost nobody realizes that emotional withdrawal usually sounds quieter than emotional pain. Anger still contains investment. Frustration still contains hope. Even disappointment suggests someone believes change is possible. But emotional indifference signals that the internal calculation has changed. The empath is no longer investing energy where experience has taught them there will be no meaningful return. And once someone reaches that point, rebuilding trust becomes dramatically more difficult because the challenge is no longer fixing the original problem. It's convincing them that trying again is emotionally worth the risk. But if they stop explaining themselves, what happens to the empathy they once gave so freely? That's where the next sign reveals an even deeper psychological transformation. One of the most dramatic shifts happens when an empath stops carrying emotional weight that was never truly theirs. Early in a relationship, empaths often become emotional stabilizers. They notice subtle changes in mood, sense tension before anyone says a word, and instinctively try to restore harmony. If you're upset, they wonder how they can help. If you're distant, they ask what happened. If there's conflict, they're usually the first to reach for a solution. This caring nature is one of their greatest strengths, but it can also become one of their biggest vulnerabilities. Over time, some people begin to rely on that emotional labor without even realizing it. They expect the empath to smooth over every disagreement, forgive every mistake, and absorb every emotional storm. The relationship slowly becomes unbalanced, with one person constantly giving and the other constantly receiving. Here's what most people completely miss. Emotional intelligence doesn't mean carrying someone else's feelings forever. Healthy empathy has boundaries. When those boundaries are repeatedly ignored, the empath's brain begins separating compassion from responsibility. They may still understand why someone behaves the way they do, but understanding no longer means sacrificing their own emotional well-being. Have you ever noticed how some people become confused when their usual emotional tactics suddenly stop working? They expect guilt to bring the empath back. They expect silence to trigger concern. They expect dramatic reactions to create another heartfelt conversation. But nothing happens. The empath remains calm, respectful, and emotionally steady. This isn't coldness, it's clarity. Imagine a man who spent years apologizing after every disagreement, even when he wasn't entirely at fault, simply because he hated emotional distance. His partner gradually learned that withdrawing affection or expressing disappointment would almost always bring another apology. One day, however, the pattern changed. Instead of chasing reassurance, he calmly acknowledged the situation, respected her space, and continued living his life without trying to fix emotions that weren't his responsibility. For the first time, the old cycle had no effect. That moment often feels shocking to the other person, because the familiar relationship dynamic has disappeared. The influence they once had over the empath's emotional decisions no longer exists. This changes everything because confidence isn't always loud. Sometimes confidence is quietly refusing to carry burdens that belong to someone else. The empath hasn't stopped caring about people. They've stopped confusing love with emotional self-sacrifice. Almost nobody realizes that this is one of the clearest signs of emotional closure. The empath still treats others with kindness and respect, but they no longer feel compelled to rescue, persuade, or emotionally manage someone who repeatedly ignored their own needs. And once that responsibility is released, another surprising change begins to appear. The conversations themselves become completely different, revealing a level of emotional detachment that few people recognize until it's already too late. One of the clearest signs an empath is emotionally done with someone isn't hostility. It's emotional neutrality. Many people expect the end of emotional investment to look dramatic, filled with arguments, tears, or harsh words. In reality, the opposite is often true. The empath becomes noticeably calmer, but not because the relationship has improved. They're calm because they've stopped expecting anything from it. This is where psychology becomes fascinating. Emotion follows significance. The more someone matters to us, the more strongly we react to their behavior. We celebrate their successes, feel hurt by their criticism, and become anxious when something feels wrong. But when the emotional bond begins to dissolve, those intense reactions naturally fade. The nervous system is no longer preparing for connection. It is preparing for distance. Have you ever noticed someone who once wanted to talk for hours suddenly keeps every conversation short and simple? They answer politely but don't expand the discussion. They no longer ask deep questions about your life. They don't argue when they disagree, and they don't chase conversations that begin to fade. Everything feels respectful, yet strangely empty. Here's where most people make a costly mistake. They interpret this calm behavior as a sign that things are finally getting better. They think, we're not fighting anymore, so we must be healing. But healthy relationships don't lose emotional depth, they gain emotional safety. If the warmth, curiosity, and genuine interest disappear, silence may not be peace. It may be emotional detachment. Consider a couple who used to spend hours discussing their future together. Even their disagreements were passionate because both people still believed the relationship was worth protecting. As time passed, one partner repeatedly felt unheard. Eventually, every conversation became transactional. Did you eat? Yes. Okay. Good night. Nothing sounded hostile. Nothing sounded broken. Yet the emotional connection that once gave those conversations meaning had quietly disappeared. Almost nobody realizes that indifference often speaks louder than anger. Anger still says, "This matters to me." Emotional neutrality says, "I've stopped expecting this to matter." This shift also affects body language. The empath may maintain eye contact out of respect, but the warmth behind it fades. Their smile becomes polite rather than spontaneous. Their posture remains relaxed, yet they no longer lean into conversations with curiosity or excitement. These subtle behavioral changes reveal what words often hide. Emotional investment has been replaced by emotional acceptance. What's even more revealing is that they don't feel the need to convince you of anything anymore. They don't need you to admit you were wrong. They don't need an apology to validate their feelings. They've already found their closure internally. But here's where the transformation becomes impossible to ignore. Once an empath reaches this level of emotional neutrality, they begin making decisions that no longer revolve around keeping the relationship alive. And that's the next sign most people never see coming. One of the strongest indicators that an empath is emotionally done isn't what they say, it's how they quietly begin reshaping their future. At first, the changes seem small. They develop new routines, reconnect with old friends, explore new interests, or spend more time alone. None of these actions appear dramatic on their own, but together they reveal a powerful psychological shift. Their identity is no longer centered around the relationship. Here's what most people completely miss. Healthy relationships naturally become part of our identity. We think in terms of we instead of me. Future plans include the other person almost automatically, but when an empath repeatedly feels unseen, unsupported, or emotionally exhausted, the brain begins protecting itself by creating a new vision of the future, where peace no longer depends on someone else's behavior. This isn't an impulsive decision. It's usually the result of countless moments that seemed insignificant at the time. Every canceled promise, every conversation that ended in frustration, every feeling that went unnoticed becomes another piece of evidence stored by the mind. Eventually, those experiences form a conclusion. I need to build a life that feels emotionally safe, even if I have to build it alone. Have you ever noticed someone who suddenly seems happier without making a big announcement? They're learning new skills, taking care of their health, pursuing hobbies they once neglected, or making plans that don't require your approval. They aren't trying to make you jealous. In fact, they rarely mention these changes at all. They're simply investing energy where it finally creates growth instead of disappointment. Imagine an empath who spent years postponing personal dreams because they believed the relationship needed all of their attention. They turned down opportunities, ignored their own ambitions, and constantly adjusted their schedule to keep the peace. Then one day, something changed. They enrolled in a course they had always wanted to take. They traveled with friends. They began exercising, reading, and setting personal goals, not because they were trying to prove a point, but because they finally remembered they had a life beyond the relationship. This is where emotional intelligence becomes visible through behavior rather than words. Self awareness teaches people that love should expand their world, not shrink it. When a relationship consistently drains more energy than it gives, rebuilding personal identity becomes an act of emotional recovery. Almost nobody realizes that this stage often confuses the other person the most. They expected tears, arguments, or desperate attempts to reconnect. Instead, they see someone becoming calmer, healthier, and more confident. That confidence doesn't come from revenge. It comes from no longer waiting for someone else to create the happiness they can build themselves. And once an empath discovers that inner stability, another surprising transformation begins. They stop reacting to emotional triggers that once had complete control over them. And that may be the most revealing sign of all. Perhaps the most surprising sign that an empath is emotionally done is this: the things that once deeply affected them no longer get a reaction. The same words, the same behaviors, even the same emotional games that once caused anxiety or heartbreak suddenly lose their power. This isn't because the empath has become emotionally numb. It's because their emotional attachment has fundamentally changed. Human behavior follows a predictable pattern. We react most strongly to people whose opinions and actions carry emotional importance. If someone we love ignores our message, we may overthink it for hours. If that same message is ignored by a stranger, we barely notice. The difference isn't the action, it's the emotional significance attached to the person. Here's where it gets interesting. When an empath reaches emotional closure, the brain begins removing that significance. The emotional triggers are still visible, but they no longer activate the same internal response. What once felt urgent now feels like information rather than a personal wound. Have you ever noticed someone who used to become anxious when you were distant, but now simply acknowledges it and moves on? They no longer chase explanations. They don't panic over delayed replies. They don't become defensive when criticized unfairly. Instead, they observe the behavior, process it calmly, and continue with their day. Many people misunderstand this shift. They assume the empath is pretending not to care or trying to make them feel guilty. But genuine emotional detachment rarely announces itself. It doesn't need to prove anything, it simply changes behavior. Imagine someone who always felt compelled to fix every disagreement before going to bed. Even after exhausting arguments, they couldn't relax until everything was resolved. Then, after years of emotional imbalance, something changes. Another disagreement happens, but this time they listen respectfully, express their thoughts once, and if the conversation becomes unproductive, they end it peacefully and go about their evening. No emotional spiral, no desperate need for reassurance. Just quiet acceptance. This is one of the clearest examples of emotional resilience. The empath has learned an important psychological lesson. Not every problem can be solved through greater effort. Some situations improve only when you stop trying to control what another person refuses to change. Almost nobody realizes that emotional freedom often looks ordinary from the outside. There are no dramatic speeches or public declarations. The biggest change happens internally. Their self-worth is no longer tied to someone else's approval, attention, or consistency. And once emotional triggers lose their influence, one final transformation takes place. It is the sign that leaves the deepest impression because it reveals that the empath hasn't just moved on emotionally. They've completely rewritten the way they choose who deserves access to their life. The final sign that an empath is emotionally done forever is also the most powerful. They stop asking, how can I save this relationship? And start asking, does this relationship still deserve a place in my life? That single question represents a complete shift in perspective. For a long time, many empaths believe that if they become more patient, communicate more clearly, or understand the other person's struggles more deeply, the relationship will eventually improve. Their natural compassion convinces them that everyone deserves another chance. And often, that's a beautiful quality. But when compassion is never met with accountability, it slowly turns into emotional exhaustion. Here's what most people completely miss. The healthiest form of empathy includes self-respect. It recognizes that understanding someone's pain doesn't require accepting repeated disrespect. You can understand why someone behaves a certain way while also deciding that their behavior is no longer welcome in your life. Have you ever noticed someone who suddenly becomes incredibly selective about where they invest their time and energy? They no longer attend every conversation, respond to every message immediately, or rearrange their entire schedule to keep someone else comfortable. Instead, they ask a different question. Does this interaction bring peace or constant stress? Imagine an empath who spent years trying to maintain a friendship where every conversation revolved around criticism, guilt, or emotional drama. They kept believing that loyalty meant staying, no matter how draining the relationship became. Then one day, they quietly stepped back. There was no dramatic goodbye, no public argument, no attempt to prove who was right. They simply chose environments where respect, honesty, and mutual effort existed naturally. Over time, they noticed something remarkable. Their anxiety decreased, their confidence returned, and they had more emotional energy for the people who genuinely valued them. This is the ultimate expression of emotional intelligence. It's not about becoming cold or shutting people out. It's about recognizing that peace is not something another person gives you. It's something you protect through the choices you make. Almost nobody realizes that when an empath reaches this point, they're no longer trying to change anyone. They've accepted one of the most important truths in relationship psychology. Lasting change only happens when people choose it for themselves. No amount of love, persuasion, or sacrifice can force another person to grow. And that's why this sign is often permanent. The empath isn't closing the door out of anger. They're closing it because they've finally learned the value of emotional safety. Once someone experiences relationships built on mutual respect instead of constant emotional repair, it's very difficult to return to patterns that once felt normal. The greatest lesson isn't that an empath leaves forever. It's that they eventually realize their kindness should never come at the cost of their own well-being. True empathy doesn't mean abandoning yourself to save someone else. It means caring deeply while still having the courage to protect your own peace. If you enjoyed this video and want to learn more about relationship psychology, human behavior, and communication, make sure to subscribe, like this video, and turn on notifications so you never miss our future content.